Hi, I'm Betsy Rosenberg, and so excited about this edition of Green TV. I know I say that every time, but there are so many interesting, knowledgeable, passionate eco-solutionaries in the forefront of so many aspects of our ecological challenge, or as I say sometimes, our planetary pickle. Renée Lertzman is someone I have known for 30 years. We worked together at an early on green news website called verde.com. It was right when the .com became .com, so it was short-lived, but since then, we've seen each other, I don't know how many dozens of conferences, climate, environment, you name it. And we were both early on in our fields. You as a climate psychologist, I don't think you weren't that then. We're going to hear about your journey. And of course, me being on a mission to bring green media to the mainstream. So since then, you have gotten a lot of attention because of your work, and you've written a book and you've given a TED Talk. You're in high demand. You're talking about something that many of us have felt for so many years, and that's eco-anxiety and a feeling of dread, oncoming dread because of the worsening climate crisis and extinction and oceans and everything else that is in decline. But it's a newer concept to the public, and it's certainly something a lot of young people especially are feeling, but not just young people. When you started out, when you decided to become a specialist in this, a climate psychologist, did you know this day was coming where there would be a feeling of overwhelm, a feeling of fear, doom, and yet we're going to talk about all the positives too?
Yes, absolutely. I knew this was coming. And this happened for me. It started when I was, 18, 19, as I tell the story a little bit in the TED Talk, where I was taking classes as an undergraduate my freshman year, and I was a psychology major, and certain I was going to become a psychologist, but then I happened to take an introduction to environmental studies, and that completely turned my world upside down. And I was struck by the weird disconnect that was happening with how we were relating with existential threats, as if we were not all profoundly impacted by these threats, and yet a group of people sitting in a lecture hall learning about these issues, and then you come out of the lecture hall and everyone's like, okay, what do you want to do now? And then going into my other classes, no mention of what's happening with the environment, with climate, with the biosphere, when in actuality this is all of our story. So I felt it viscerally and directly, and I know that I'm not alone. I think I was like a early adopter or whatever. It's like I knew that this was going to be happening, and I didn't know when. But it doesn't surprise me that it's exploded the way it has, especially over the past 2 to 3 years, and even the past year, and even the past 6 months, and the past few months. That doesn't surprise me, but I also, it was so many years that I was working on this edge where I was basically approaching pitching, whether it was articles, whether it was books, whether it was engagements with organizations, to say, hey, we really need to pay attention to the psychology of these issues. And there was just such resistance to that. And now it's like, it seems like the penny has dropped. So none of us could have seen this happening the way it did. But yes, from my perspective, and anyone who has the kind of psychological lens, it was just a matter of time. And now that time seems to have arrived.
Almost overnight, not really, but almost overnight. And I know that feeling completely of living in a parallel universe, and I've done something similar with the mainstream news industry. Like, this is the biggest story. Why don't you have any coverage? Why don't you have any specialists? Why don't you have climate correspondents? Now they're starting to, but this is 20 years that, I've been watching it and trying to get back into mainstream because that was my background. But this is something that it's so existential. It's such a big threat that I guess a lot of people just have a hard time wrapping their heads around it. I find it so interesting. I was a psychology major too, the sociological perspective of like 2 tracks. There are those of us who have lost sleep over ecological collapse for many, many years. And then there's so many people who seem to be not aware of it, either choosing to not be aware, selective ignorance, if you will, or not bothered by it. Why do you think that is? Just to kind of get into the whole psychological piece of it, why do some of us, like, once we know, we can't not know, and it's a mixed blessing to be ahead on something that is so big and devastating, and those who, for whatever reasons, have not taken it in and therefore not doing anything about it. So it's
right. Well, I think that's extremely complicated to unpack why it is that some people, communities, sectors are more kind of engaged or waking up than others. I think it has a lot to do with, again, it's not an individual phenomenon. It's important to see that as individuals, we are part of systems, networks, relationships, socio-cultural, economic backgrounds that influence our way of engaging and dealing and processing the world. I think a lot of it has to do with agency. And if one feels or experiences or has been told that they have some agency in the world, and in our world, that's often, elite folks who are born into a system where it's like, oh, you can do anything. And, I think that increases our psychological threshold for engaging with big, audacious, systemic issues, because there's something in oneself, including myself as a white, middle-class American, like, oh, maybe I can engage with this in some way or another. If one has been taught or is internalized this perception that I am powerless, I don't have agency, then what we will do as humans is we will manage our way of relating with the world such that we can function, which is to not engage, to minimize it, to push it away. And it's not that people don't care about the issue. So it's really about how are people managing the discomfort and the distress that the issues bring up. And I think that is the number one single frame and insight that we need to have, that we have not had for 30 plus years, that frankly frustrates me, is that there's been this like prevailing, what I call the myth of apathy. That was my PhD thesis. That was the focus of my book. It's informed pretty much everything I do, which is, it's actually grounded in research-based psychology. It's not something I just made up, which is that it's not about whether people care. And the people working on the front lines who woken up and they're like, we have to do something, have been going around basically unintentionally triggering the hell out of people, including stakeholders, people you're trying to pitch to in media. We have good intentions, but we come along and we say, hey, we need to look at this. And then when people are not able to cope with it or dismiss us or deny us or don't respond or whatever, then we make up a story and we say, oh, they don't care. This isn't as important to them as it is to me, rather than really thinking what might be going on here and why are they, why is this behavior happening? Why is there this avoidance? Like everything we're talking about is well documented in psychology. It's called defense mechanisms 101. And if there's one single thing that anyone working on climate change and environmental issues can learn and get literate on right now, it's about defense mechanisms. It's kind of that simple, but it's very complicated. But it's like, if you come to understand that a lack of engagement, and even the other extreme, people who are just like in those industries who are actively causing harm and damage, that in itself is a form of disconnect, of disavowal. Disavowal is when we know something, but we are choosing not to be aware of it. It's not the same as denial, where you're saying, oh, there is no climate change. Disavowal is, I'm just going to look over here and act as if that's not real.
Compartmentalized, I guess.
Compartmentalizing. So that's where I'm at. It's like, I actually do feel a sense of urgency, and I feel some, I guess, some frustration, which I'm channeling into constructive conversations like this one, which is, come on, people, like, we're heading into COP26. We're like, let's bring some psychological, like a tiny bit of psychological insight into the mix. And guess what? It's going to be this X factor. And I've seen it over and over again. It actually does happen, but it's like getting us to shift our mindset from, oh, no one cares about this. How do we wake people up and motivate? It's time to stop talking about motivational language. Forget that, it's engage.
Right. There's been a lot of, articles written, talk about how, how do we talk about climate change? Should we, scare people because the scientific facts are truly frightening? Or should we, just give them agency and, we can do this, and downplay the actual potential worst case scenarios? And I think you believe what I believe, which is you have to do both. When I do my interviews, the problem and the solution, you have to keep them as much as you can in the same conversation. Is that something that you have found really works better, not an either or approach?
Yeah, absolutely. So I call it, blowing up the hope and despair binary. I think that it's more complex and nuanced than a lot of people working in the space interpret. So right now, we're in, I think, a developmental phase where we're trying to figure out how to tell the truth and not trigger people, which is, what I've been talking about for like many, many years is, I've had these diagrams where it's like, what is that I call it this golden trine between the activation, like, this is what's happening, this is how serious it is, this is what's at stake and the threat, and then not wanting to trigger the defense mechanisms into, oh, I can't deal with this.
Paralysis.
Yeah. And the tendency from those who don't have much of a psychological orientation is to just push the solutions and the hopefulness and the optimism. And I call that the hope police. It's a way of policing ourselves and others. And that's not really effective. And it creates it's like a ricochet. It's sort of like reinforcing this, like, oh, it's all bad and despair, or I have to focus only on the positive solutions. And in actuality,
save us. There's nothing I have to do.
Yeah. And in actuality, if we want to really build a resilient, effective way of engaging with these issues for the long haul, if we're really talking about transformative system change, then we have to be able to look at and hold space for taking stock of our current reality. But the real key is to create containers or spaces for people to process that. And that can be a whole variety of ways, including the narratives we use in the media or the storytelling. It includes, having literal spaces. And especially if you're in an organization, I think you have a responsibility as an organization to provide space for people to basically say, let's look at what's happening together in a container. And then now we can look at how we want to engage with this. What do we want to do about this? What makes sense for us, whether as an individual, a team, a leadership team, a organization. You move into the activation, but it's like, it's grounded in and has roots in reality. And that's hard reality. And, trying to avoid that or sugarcoat that is really offensive. It's sort of like, it's patronizing to say, oh, you can't handle this, it's going to be too much for you.
Well, and that's what some of the television news networks have felt. Well, we don't want to scare our viewers. They'll walk over to Fox where they hear that climate change is not a problem, it's a hoax. Look where that's gotten us. 20 years wasted for the most part in terms of mainstream public reaction. And that's obviously clearly got to stop. What's interesting, there's so many interesting things about this. I wonder if when you're dealing with a group, people in a company, some organization, is it easier because they're going through this process together? Because I know as someone like you early on has been kind of obsessed with this. I guess my husband would say yes, obsessed. But so many of my people, non-green friends are not, and just going through that weird place of like, why aren't they concerned? And then you
Yeah.
feel weird, there's something wrong with me, but no, there's something wrong with society that we're not responding to this. So
Mhm.
that's first question. Is it easier to do this as a group? And then I want to talk about COVID and the parallels and what we might have learned from it, and see if you think we have a climate lesson in there in the pandemic.
Yeah. So, yes, I think it's essential that we feel that we're not alone and we're with other people. So there's a lot of research that and work that I draw on, such as one of many, many, many is Daniel Siegel, who prominent psychiatrist, neuroscientist, who's written a lot around, how we trauma, how we process information, mindfulness. So he talks about something called the window of tolerance, where we have a window of how much stress and stress we can tolerate.
Mhm.
And he talks about this as a window, and how on the one end of the window, we get bumped into just paralysis and withdrawal. And then on the other hand, can be more of a rigid kind of activation, angry. And so what he has identified, which again is not rocket science from a psychodynamic perspective, is that what keeps us in the window of tolerance is feeling attuned when we are in attunement with others. So that's why, so I started a project a couple of years ago. I got a grant from the KR Foundation to create some tools and resources that bring a lot of this out for organizations. It's not really intended for just, or kind of anyone. It's like if you're an organization and you want to apply this work, and we have these 5 guiding principles that are distilled from all these best practices out there in the health sector and in psychology and healing and trauma and all of that. And these 5 guiding principles are, attune, reveal, so tell the story, talk about what's happening compassionately, equip people with the tools and resources they need. So be an equipper, a gardener of others, and convene. Convene is absolutely essential. So be a convener, get people into groups and interaction. And then the 5th is sustain. How do we sustain beyond the pledge, the campaign, the target, the goal, all these like kind of episodic quick bursts of energy? How do we actually sustain that? Which it's sort of, they're all kind of mutually reinforcing. Because if you're convening people, it's reinforcing the energy and momentum. If you're giving people tools and resources, then people are able to self-actualize and come up with all kinds of solutions that, we could not have predicted. So it's all connected. But the being together in relationship is fundamental to any of this work.
Well, we are social creatures, and there's social research, I'm sure know it well, but I've done it just in real life. We moved to Texas a couple of years ago, and it's the outskirts, so it's pretty rural, pretty conservative, certainly much more than the Bay Area where I'm from. And our neighbors fought our solar panels, and we went to the HOA and made a case, and we won. We put our solar panels on, and then another house did that, and then someone else asked us at the community pool, what about your solar panels? So we do need to model, right? Because if people, especially, I say the same thing, if you're not seeing this in the news every night, why would you think this is the existential crisis it is? If you're not seeing your neighbor, and Texas, a lot of hot sun. So there is that phenomenon of they're doing it. So now, like, we need to obviously expand that, ramp that up, quickly and loudly, to show, whether it's a hybrid car or, recycling, compost, that's pretty basic right now, but there's so many more things, and they're not all visible, obviously. But if our solar panels are on the back side of our house, just because that's facing the west, I really wanted them to be on the front so more people would see them. Back to another area that I know we don't really have time to delve into. I would love to have you back, because this is fascinating. How many of you are there? It seems like all of a sudden I'm hearing about psychologists who are specializing in this, and I've wondered if I should go to one. And is it for people like me who I call it my environmental illness? I'm so committed, I may end up committed, because if you know too much, sometimes it's a difficult thing to live with and have a normal life and not drive your family crazy. Or is it for people who are just learning about it and they're anxious? Or all of the above. And is this in fact a growing area of specialty?
Yeah, it's a rapidly evolving field. So I don't think there's many people like me specifically because I work with organizations and I do not do private practice. I'm not a therapist, but I work with organizations to bring in psychological insights into engagement strategy, into leadership development. So that's pretty rare. What is happening though is an incredible activation within the psychological field, mental health and clinical fields. It's just crazy. So when I was living in the UK in 2003 to 2010, I was part of the founding of this group called the Climate Psychology Alliance. And back then they were holding these events in London and around the UK with psychologists coming together, and they were amazing events, and they were a little bit, kind of on the edge. And now it's just, it's growing. There's a North American chapter there. I'm getting emails from groups almost every day from different parts of the world, where psychologists are starting to organize. And there's a terminology that's starting to be used called climate aware therapy. Climate aware therapists. There's people in the States. There's folks like my colleague Wendy Greenspun in New York who's starting to do trainings. There's all kinds of people in the States and overseas who are now working with and training therapists to create more of the sensitivity around helping people process and deal with their climate anxiety and the feelings that come up for them. My hope is that more organizations that work on these issues actively partner with psychologists. I think that's been very slow to happen. And I mean, for all the way from the big ones like NRDC, WWF, the Sierra Club, like the Big 10 or whatever, all the way to the more kind of scrappy, startup-y kind of initiatives and programs that are starting to come forward that are grassroots, that are focusing on inclusion, of equity, of climate justice. I see that happening. It's not to say that psychologists are the only ones who have insight and wisdom when it comes to processing our feelings and grief and so forth. A lot of indigenous communities and grassroots communities and vulnerable communities, there are many, many deep, wise practices that humans have that I see starting to be brought into the picture. I was just on a panel a few days ago with a scientist. She's a climate scientist with Environmental Defense Fund. Kriti is her name. I have to look up her last name, but she was talking about composting grief and grief circles, and I was just like amazed. Like she's not
composting grief. Is that like composting grief, or grief about compost?
Well, it's a way of thinking about how we work with our grief.
Yeah.
And that's a level of nuance and insight that we are needing right now. And so I was so encouraged to hear her talking about that. So this is definitely a thing. It's like people are now, my hope is that within a short time, this is going to just be normalized.
And
yeah.
Speaking of not normal, we've just gone through 18 months of a pandemic, and look at the difference in the way the media covered it in terms of it being a true emergency and showing the problems and showing the solutions. Granted, addressing climate and other ecological threats is a lot more complicated than putting on a mask or getting a vaccine. But if they would cover the climate emergency, which of course is also a health emergency, economic emergency, crisis, the same way, I'm sure we would have seen and would be seeing a lot more action. Do you think that the public, and this is a broad generalization here, but I wonder about this, is feeling just too burnt out? And it's always like, there's never a good time to talk about this stuff, right? It's either the 80s were, party on and what problem, or things are so bad, we're dealing with a recession back in 2008. We can't deal with climate change. Coming out of this pandemic, I mean, one would hope that one of the big takeaways is things can go wrong really quickly. that we are a small world. We are connected to nature. Nature is in charge. And of course, there are environmental underpinnings to the pandemic, whether that was brought out enough, in the coverage. It wasn't, of course. But what's your sense of that? I feel like people are more sober. I feel like people are more aware of death. And so one would hope that that would be able to be transferred over to the planet dying, and without a healthy planet or nature thriving, it's not going to be good for us, humans or any other living creatures. What's your sense of which way that's going right about now as we seemingly come out of the pandemic?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really big topic. And what I will say very briefly on that is that two things. One is that the experience with COVID obviously woke us up to the systemic nature of reality, like without question, on many, many, many levels. Like, whether just watching the events of 2020 unfold, where we were able to make visible what has been invisible with regards to the systems in which we live. So one breakdown over here all of a sudden causes a breakdown over here that was completely not, we weren't conscious of. Like, I just remember one random example of something around school lunches, like, oh, if kids aren't going to school, what about the children who rely on that to get, their lunches? And now there's a crisis when it comes to feeding young families who don't have just like crazy, like a lot of profound systemic consciousness was like woken up. And so that really does serve and support our climate consciousness. The important distinction is the causality. And this is something I feel really strongly about, which is that we're even in the way that question is being framed, it reflects still a tendency we have to overlook the power dynamics of climate crisis, environmental issues, which is really about industry, and it's really about power. And it's about taking a look at how we live and basically saying, shedding a light on the injustice and the violence of how we live around the world, these systems. And so calling attention to that, it's not the same as saying, hey, let's look at COVID. It's not the same. This is a psychosocially, politically different ballgame. And that's why it will never be covered quite in the same way, as long as we have the systems in place where the networks are reliant on, their advertisers. And so it's just very, very complicated. And I'm hopeful that we've cracked the door open. And there's so much conversation about this that's happening right now. So I actually feel profoundly hopeful. It's just going to be a rocky road for the next while. It's as things start to really, like what happened with Black Lives Matter and all of that, we have not seen anything yet. It's going to get very intense. All this stuff under the surface is going to rise. We're going to have to face our societal demons. It'll be like going through a detox. And then I'm confident we're going to get to the other side.
Well, I look forward to that. In the meantime, we ought to buckle up. And I think we adults ought to start showing our kids, the youth movement, that we're at least going to do our best to try now that we know what we know. So I don't let fellow baby boomers off the hook, because, many of them have more time, more money, and certainly should care about their kids and grandchildren's future. So I know that's another topic altogether, the youth activist movement. But to put it on a positive note, yes, it's wonderful that they're speaking up and marching and rallying even during COVID, but it's not okay to just leave it to them to solve.
Right. Definitely.
Renée Lertzman, it went too fast. We'll have to do this again. There's so much to talk about. It's my psychological background. It's my obsession with the climate, and it's your great work that really makes me want to just ask you a bunch more questions, but you've got to run, and we will do it again. Thanks so much.
Yes. Lovely talking to you. Thank you.
Interesting times, right?
Yeah.
Hey, got to say that, interesting times.
Yeah.
does it for this edition of Green TV. Please go to our website, subscribe. The more subscribers we have, the more content we can give you. We hope to be 24/7 live streaming sooner rather than later. It's later than we think on a lot of levels. So please tell everyone you know about this. This is not for everybody, this content. It's only for those who eat, breathe, or drink. See you next time.